In this episode, I'm joined once again by Massimiliano Simons, who is a postdoctoral researcher in philosophy of science at Ghent University. In this episode, we discuss Michel Serres' text, Angels, a Modern Myth. I'd like to say a big thank you to my paid patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible, and if you would like to support Hermitix and gain access to some exclusive content, please find links in the description below. Otherwise, please enjoy. So, Massimiliano Simons, thanks very much for joining us once again on Hermitix podcast for another Michel Serres episode.
Happy to be here. Always happy to talk about Michel Serres.
This episode, we're talking about a text by Serres called Angels, a Modern Myth. This text has, I don't want to say gone under the radar because quite a lot of Serres texts have done that in a way, but this one isn't mentioned anywhere near as much as the Five Senses or the Troubadour of Knowledge, etc. This is published in, I believe, 1995 in English. I think 1993 in French originally, and it's quite a strange book for a philosophy text in its actual form. It's full of gorgeous images of Renaissance imagery, paintings, sculpture, along with modern images of just everyday people in a way. And it's following two angels, a discussion between two angels. It's also one of the clearer Serres texts on his philosophy of communication and the philosophy of movement. And it's also about this sort of strange idea of how angels are taken in relation to communication and can be understood within the modern world as something which is still around. So I guess I'll just open it up with the question of how that would be my very practical overview of the text. But how would you explain angels?
First of all, I completely agree that the book is often wrongfully neglected, and reasons you gave, to which we will return, are indeed the images and the strange format, the dialogue form, etc., and the theme. Although you find the claim quite often that Serres likes angels, but then they never really delve into this book. So indeed, what is this figure of angels that Serres puts at the foreground? Well, he often starts precisely with a kind of etymology of angels, which comes from the Greek word for messenger, and so someone who delivers a message, who brings over a message. And I think that's what Serres appreciates in it. So that angel as a concept is an action. It is a transmission. So it's not so much a certain claim about a material being or an immaterial being, but really what they do, and that's what fascinates him. So when he makes a claim in the book also that angels are everywhere, or that we're living in a society of angels or something like that, I don't read it as so much as an empirical claim, there are angels, but rather as a kind of investigation to what extent angels can be a useful framework through which we can analyze empirical phenomena. It's a bit like analyzing the world in terms of mechanisms or causes, or in social sciences as individuals, groups, or societies. These things themselves do not directly refer to empirical phenomena, but are more like schemes through which we schematize the world. And I think in that sense also angels are a way to propose a framework by which we can analyze, in this book especially, also the modern world. Can we read it not in terms of causes or individuals, but in terms of angels? What would that do? In that sense, it's a bit similar to one of our previous sessions where we talked about the parasite. The same was there. It was not the claim that they are parasites, but what would happen? What can we tell about the world if we read it in terms of parasites, and so on? And I think this book does the same with this figure of angels. And maybe just a final thing, there is a translation shift in the title. So the English one is indeed Angels, a Myth, or a Modern Myth, or something like that. Whereas in the French original, it is, if you would translate it, Angels, a legend. So he uses that word of legend there, not just in the meaning of an old story, whatnot, but also of a legend of a map, a way to read a map, which you typically found this line means this. Well, again, angel as a kind of legend for a modern society.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, so he's not. The strange thing with this text is, as we'd all immediately sort of have the habit of thinking of angels in a religious context. He's not really taking on some theological dialogue with angels. It is they are immediately used in that Serrean fashion of becoming a function within the world, as opposed to like a theological anchor or something like that.
In a way that's indeed true. It's not a focus on, or not restricted to, a theological debates or an angelology or something like that. But at the same time, it's not an exclusion of these elements. It's more precisely kind of typical Saracen claim also that distinction, as if a book is either about theological angels or about real or modern stuff, is something he would deny. But it's not the center focus, let's put it that way, the theological debate. But he will mobilize a lot of elements to say something not probably also about the Bible, but also about our society nowadays.
I mean, that's a strange comment already. I mean, it always. I never like the start of these talks where I have to explain a Serres text, right? If you say, "What's this text about?" As you've said, it's not particular to this text alone to say there is no center focus for Serres. I mean, there are, of course, we could say sort of things which his texts are orbiting around, but there's never a central focus. And I think, you sort of there's never really a clear duality, as if it's some conversation between, I don't know, theology or empiricism or something like that. I get the impression that Serres is almost saying, just let me write philosophy. Why do I need to gravitate it around some centralized focus? Doing so would harm the subject itself in a way.
Yeah, in a way, and it's linked with this notion of angels as well. I always read his text as indeed, and this book embodies that. He takes a kind of starting point, and there might be just one thing that he noticed, and then almost the book is structured as if that thing itself almost autonomously develops itself, and he just gives it room to see what can we do with this thought if we do not precisely restrict it beforehand by saying, no, we are only going to talk about theology, or no, we are not going to talk about angels because they have nothing to do with modernity or something like that. It is this kind of, I think Latour described it somewhere about Serres, like Serres always picks the sides not of the knower but of the known, so of the phenomenon itself. And of course, I mean, there is still restrictions on that. Serres does smuggle in some interpretation, etc. It's not that he necessarily succeeds in this, but I think that is his ambition, at least.
Mm-hmm. So this first thing that he notices is really in noticing this philosophy of angels, he immediately notices the philosophy of compatibility with the modern world. How can this be that angels can coexist with the modern world?
Yeah, indeed, if you would summarize the book, probably it's that claim that angels are compatible with the modern world, and even that that the modern world is a world full of angels. So it's even further than compatibility. It's even like angels are the central element or something like that, or could be the central element. And I would say indeed that's, again, a very provocative element of Serres, since indeed angels are believed typically to be completely outdated or obsolete, or some kind of superstition, or linked to a religious world that is separate indeed from the modern world. But again, and here we link it again with all kinds of other works of Serres. Serres' work is often a way to problematize that modern mode of thinking, which indeed interprets history of science, but also social history, in terms of radical breaks that once and for all separates us from these pre-modern or religious elements that we have that we are out of touch with. Again, if I can make a reference to another book, I think you also discussed it with David Webb, his book on Lucretius, the Bird of Physics. Again, I would read that book really as an attempt to, well, whereas we once thought Lucretius as being about pure poetry and outdated physics, Serres would claim in his contemporary time, in times of fluid mechanics and chaos theory, it regains all of its actuality. And I think something similar applies in this book to angels, whereas they once looked very outdated, very foreign to our contemporary world, suddenly they are regaining all of their actuality. And he says that, I think in an interview as well, if you read the amount of books about angelology in the Middle Ages and translate certain words into modern language, you see that the same problems of translation, messages, etc., are our problems of today. Again, in that sense, this book, Angels, suddenly regains their actuality because they can be a legend for our contemporary society.
Mm. Do you think that in that reactualization of angels in the modern day, there is for Serres an understanding of the change of form, or is it the change of something else in them? You know, does something need to change in angels for Serres for them to become compatible in the way they are, or you know, do they retain exactly that same form, but something else is there for us to be able to apprehend them as angels?
There are obviously things that you will find in theological discussions about angels that you will not find in the modern society, etc. It is again not a claim that everything about angels is suddenly relevant or something, but that there are certain patterns in these seemingly irrelevant debates about angels that if you transpose them to our contemporary society, they can help us to understand problems better. Some parts, not others. And again, that probably has to do with as we started, angels are, first of all, messengers, but obviously in theological debate, angels are typically more, they have different meanings, etc. So it is, I think there is a selective element there as well, that some parts of what we associate with angels are more put in the center. But at the same time, again, and this is also one of the reasons why the book is quite beautiful, that he tries to explore as many options as well. It's not just about messages, it's also about hell and heaven. It's also about the good and the bad linked to angels, and these elements, like being an angel for another person, something like that, the saving angel who saves someone else. These kind of dimensions are also explored, but I would say less prominently than the communication angle, and that's typically the kind of disembodied, well, not the best term for it, but I mean, kind of transposed idea of an angel in a more formal manner than the details that you will find in theological treatises.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, perhaps this idea will begin to sort of coalesce a bit more if we focus on the philosophical aspects of the text in relation to angels, which of course they themselves are sort of a function of the philosophy. And I think if I was to, if someone said, Michel Serres, is he a philosopher of what? I think it would probably be more apt to say he is a philosopher of messages. He's definitely a philosopher of communication, but I wonder if messages is more apt. You know, this idea of communication is a very sterile way to talk about it, and messages is that appreciation of how something is being communicated. And I guess I'm just going to ask the huge question, because this, of course, I think me and you have touched on the other two Serres talks that we've done, because as we've said before, with Serres, all elements of his philosophy are in some way in every single book in some manner, but he just has larger focuses on certain topics within certain books. And this text, Angels, is most definitely a text focused on his philosophy of communication. So what is communication for Serres? And as we're talking about messengers, an angel as a messenger, what is a message for Serres?
Indeed, very, very big questions there. I like the indeed communication is is a central term, and at certain moments Serres would indeed even describe himself as a philosopher of communication or of relations. That's even more general. Or what he also often does is a philosopher of presuppositions, of proposition. Think of presuppositions, right? So things that connect substances and adjectives and whatnot to one another, like to and for and these kind of notions that link things, that precisely are the moments in a sentence where the message goes from or the relation is created between one element and the other. But yeah, communication, what is it? Big question. I would say it's a very long story that you need for that. In a way, you could link it to the birth of information theory. So let me make a couple of steps to get to Serres. I would say the first step is indeed, and Serres refers to this, the end of the 19th century. You have statistical mechanics coming into being, and we analyze events in the world in forms of statistics, not just of the purely fixed causes linked to Boltzmann and Maxwell and whatnot. And can we analyze physical phenomena regularities in terms of probabilities? And it's typically linked with the famous second law of thermodynamics: entropy increases. And again, that's a question of probability. Over time, the probability that entropy, that disorder in a closed system is maximalized nears 100%. First step. Second step then is, and then we get closer to Serres, is in the 20th century when you have information theory, which Serres is a big fan of, with Claude Shannon and Leo Brillouin, etc., who argue that, well, we can, if you take that framework of thermodynamics very seriously, interpret information as negative entropy, negentropy as they would call it. As something is informative if it is statistically or probabilistically unlikely. A very simple example would be, if I enter a room and see a hot cup of coffee, well, that is very informative, more informative than it was cold or absent. Why? Well, there are less scenarios possible with a hot cup of coffee in the room. Somebody must have been around. If it was just cold coffee, it would just probably be noise, disorder, someone should clean it up, etc. But if it is hot, well, I know certainly if I'm looking for someone, that he or she might be around. Hence, that kind of idea that information is the improbable case in the probable case of entropy disorder. And I would say, especially likes is precisely that there is some kind of similarity between the unlikelihood of physical or biological order and information. Namely, it's not just about communicating messages, but even about physical phenomena. That there is something as orderly as a star, a planet, a solar system, a living organism, society, a human society, an informative text, etc. They are all very similar in the sense that they are rare, improbable, and in that sense contain a lot of information, precisely about how unlikely the self-organization of that system is, given that there is entropy and the second law of thermodynamics. Now, what according to Serres then precisely happens, and that's why information and communication become central for him, I would say, is that what you also see in his time in recent developments in science, like molecular biology, that life itself can also be characterized by a very specific state of information, DNA code, or now they would say the kind of organization of biological systems, which are, again, very rare, improbable, complex. And thus, you get to a kind of picture in Serres that we can look at the world really in terms of messages between everything, and not just between humans or between cultural phenomena, but even between life forms. They exchange information in the sense that they exchange improbable states, etc. Even physical phenomena like solar systems, planets, etc., embody that information. So you get a kind of picture of the world in terms of an ever exchange of messages with one another. One final point, perhaps, before this story becomes too long, is for Serres also, this information is never absolute. Again, that's something we'll find in information theory. whether something is informational for you is not absolutely given, but relative to your position as an observer. Let me get back to the example. Whether the hot cup of coffee is informative depends on what I'm looking for. If I'm looking for a person, then it can become very important. If I'm not, then I will probably ignore it as noise, etc. And in a certain sense, again, all the kind of things you face in the world, kind of noise, whether it's meaningful or not, also depends precisely on the framework and the position one is looking for. And in that sense, that the world is constantly throwing at me probable and improbable things, but most of it is irrelevant. What is relevant becomes then a question of what is my position and my relation? How am I relationally defined to these things? So in that sense, communication is, and that's an idea you find in the Hermes series, which you also, I think, discussed in the previous session, not so much exchanging information in a sea of silence, but the reverse. Within a constant flood of noise, constant exchange of meaningless messages for you, a medium is created in which one improbable and hence meaningful message can be transmitted. And then again, and that's almost, again, you get back to the figure of the angel. The angel is the one who, within this chaos, embodies that attempt to bring a message to you in a meaningful way. And so in that sense, Serres would say, that's one of his quotes in his early books, to dialogue, to communicate, is to exclude the third, or better, to replace that third with a better medium, parasite, exchanging, and you get that themes there as well. If you want to have a conversation, you exclude the noisy elements and you replace it with something meaningful. Probably people listening to this, they have to exclude a lot of noise if they want to understand us, right? That kind of idea. There is already this noise. And the angels are interesting because they embody the kind of work that is typically needed to bring over a message. Again, in the Bible, you will find these stories. Where do these angels show up? They typically show up in a kind of moment of surprise. People are doing all kinds of other things. They find it meaningful, but suddenly you shift from a kind of framework and all these daily activities become noise, and the angel and the message that the angel wants to transmit to you becomes the center. And so the angel is there to really install a kind of new framework, a new perspective in which noise and information shift, etc. And you are typically the figure in the Bible is then focused on the right things. And that's the typical function of the angel, has to redirect the attention or something like that.
Do you think that's also possibly a hidden purpose of Serres' philosophy in general, is the teaching regarding the exclusion of noise and the expansion of a horizon of meaning with regards to life, the ability to be able to draw a more qualitative relationship with what it is. I'm thinking of food. From Serres' philosophy, food can become more, the exact same scenario with Serres' philosophy can become much more in terms of its meaning.
Yeah, in a way, I agree with that. Indeed, many of his works are attempts to almost redistribute noise and information, or what we see as noise and information. When I was also rereading this book, I was reminded, I think that's an element of the book, The Troubadour of Knowledge, Le Tiers Instruit, which we also discussed. I think at some moment he also discusses this idea that indeed there's this social noise, people always making noise, and we cannot focus on the right things. I think it might be in that book, or it might be in The Five Senses, where he's just relaxing in Greece somewhere within relaxing of the site or something, and then you have a group of tourists intervening and not focusing on the right things. They are just focusing on their social bubble or something like that. Now, why am I saying this? There is a kind of ethical element here as well, in the sense that Serres would say that would raise that question, why do people do the things they do, focus on the things they do? And there is a kind of false image that they are focusing on the object itself, whereas, and here we get to that different levels of, or different layers of perspective, what is order, what is chaos, that you can only understand their behavior at the next level. I'm making it too abstract. Let me make a very concrete case. So what he has in mind is that people, for instance, also on television, you see a lot of messages, a lot of information, but we should wonder, what are they communicating? And they're not so much communicating on the level of propositions. They want to tell you really give you some information, but typically on a higher level, where they are communicating about social status, about what you should buy or shouldn't buy, what society should be or not, social norms, etc. On that level, they are communicating. Whereas the result is then that the criteria of what is meaningful and noise is on that level, and not on the level of producing knowledge for one another. On that level, there is a lot of production of noise, precisely because that is not the kind of framework in which these mediums like television are thinking. They are thinking on a higher level. And I think in that sense, you find the ethical element there of, we should really think about what are the frameworks that distribute order and chaos, or information and noise, and what are the right ones if we indeed want to focus on knowledge, or in the case of food, also on good food, and not just the social status associated with the food or something like that.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's really interesting, because there seems to be some not hierarchical but layers of discussion regarding messages there. Of course, so when we think of, let's say, like you were saying about the message put across, it's often taken as the content of the message is of importance. You know, an advert says, buy this certain thing, no one's thinking about the status, right? Or the messages behind that. So it's just the content which is of importance. And then, of course, you have someone like Marshall McLuhan who would say the medium itself, the television, is the message. But it seems quite absurdly and almost humorously, Sarah is saying the message is the message.
Yeah, in a way, because it's really about the idea that it is indeed, there's not an absolute point through which one is the medium or the message, right? That depends on what layer you're on. So the kind of picture I highlighted from this whole informational theoretical perspective highlights a picture of the world as a number of relative layers in which one can situate itself, and then you have this question of what is chaos on one level can be, or what is disorder on one level can be order on another level. And it is also very productive in that sense. And so it's not just negative, it's also the other way around, in a sense that we are having a conversation. Obviously, there's hopefully some information. There's also a lot of noise. But that noise itself can become very meaningful if your goal is something else. If you, for instance, want to understand, clearly my English is not perfect, you can shift the question not to understanding me, but where is he from? Let me find out. Then the kind of noise elements become very meaningful to answer that question. So it can also be very productive to teach you new things. So in that sense, there is not again, it's very relevant to focus on that relativity of the layer one is focusing on, the framework one is focusing on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. So what, in terms of, what we were speaking about there, in terms of the messages in relation to the medium and the messages coming from the messenger, in what sense are the messages of importance in relation to embodiment and should we say, embodying something within the world that we can interact with?
Yeah, the question of embodiment is interesting. Again, it links it to this figure of the angel, because he's typically seen as the one who's not embodied at all, not material, immaterial, or something like that. Although again, I think precisely that relativity will help us to answer that question. I would say that given that the starting point for Serres is to restrict noise, not so much to produce noise in a sea of silence, then yes, it has to be embodied. Embodied meaning a framework that excludes all the irrelevant elements and creates a meaningful dialogue. And again, we gave the example of us having the conversation, but also of the angel trying to shift the focus. So in that sense, it also becomes meaningful, and that was one of the claims by Serres that struck me also in the book and in interviews about that book, that old debates about angels, for instance, whether they have sexes, can become very relevant again. Whereas they seemingly sound nonsensical, and I typically used to joke about how irrelevant these debates were. Oh, is an angel male or female? Haha, what a meaningless question. Well, according to Serres, well, if we look what is almost formally at stake in that question, they suddenly regain their full relevance again. Namely, it is about the question, is the messenger, the medium, the embodiment, is it neutral or is it distorting? If angels have sexes, personalities, human characters, needs, whatnot, then you are also you're also faced with the question, will that introduce distortions of the message that from God? Is the angel still really delivering the message of God, or is it adding, shifting, transforming that message through its actions? So angelology then suddenly becomes a very relevant science, according to Serres, would say, for our contemporary problems, which are all faced with these questions of communication and when is an expert really speaking in name of science, when is the politician really speaking in name of the public, etc. All that kind of questions that are very relevant today have, on a formal level, kind of isomorphy with these angelological questions, these theological questions. So by rethinking about our world in terms of angels, we can also reinterpret that problem of distortion in terms, for instance, here of embodiment. What does the embodiment of the angel in that form brings to the table? Is it distorting? Is it helping? Is it enhancing or destroying the message?
Okay. That's quite strange for Serres, because that almost seems top down, God through the angels through to something else, in terms of that sort of the hierarchy of angels. Perhaps I'm getting it a bit wrong, but that also would relate to the sort of parasitic relationship and also a relationship of entropy, right? The message itself has been fed through various sources, and eventually what you receive, it has been molded in relation to what the previous messenger considered relevant, and so you end up with this sort of whittled down vision of something which long ago was perhaps grander or perhaps smaller or completely entirely different. So the danger is in the, as you say, the danger is in almost the temperament of the angel.
Yeah, hence also the question about fallen angels, about is the angel still following God or is it following the devil or something like that? For Serres, they become very relevant. And I agree indeed, if there might, it links back to an earlier question, if some elements might disappear, one of these things is indeed that there is a very strict hierarchy between God at the top and then the angels following or something like that. It reminds me a bit of his attitude towards Leibniz also. Leibniz and his monadology, you have a very similar point that there is one God at the top and he has all the strings to all the monads, and the monads do not communicate among one another. So I would say, well, it sounds again ridiculous from a certain point of view, but from a, for instance, in this case, mathematical point of view, it's the most simple system. You have the least amount of relations because you only have one arrow between every point and not arrows between all the points, which creates a kind of chaos. But Serres would even then say Leibniz is relevant to think about communication today, like angels, but he would add, we are living in a Leibnizian world, but without God. And there is not this ultimate hierarchy. So we have this similar framework, but there is not an endpoint to the layers when you go up. As you say, there is indeed someone who is transmitting the message, but if you just poke it a bit, you just get an endless chain of angels communicating these messages. There is no end to that.
Yeah, and speaking of angels, I guess we should quite a way in now. We should introduce the two angels that are primary to the discussion, the dialogue which is happening in the text, which is I hope I'm pronouncing these correctly. Pia and Panope or Panope.
Yeah, indeed. Well, how to pronounce it? That's a good question. It depends also. Well, whether so that it opens again that question whether we are good angels for these names, right? But indeed, the book is self-structured as a dialogue between these two figures. I think Panope is a engineer and traveling inspector for Air France, and Paya is a kind of doctor at Charles de Gaulle Airport. And indeed, they are angels. The planes are angels. I mean, everything is almost called angels in the book. Anyway, they together discuss, starting from what they see at the airport, a whole set of themes about politics, mythology, science, religion, etc. And it brings us to one of our starting points, right? The strangeness of this text, and also perhaps the reason why it is not always read, because it's a dialogue. It's even less structured in that sense than other books by Serres, where you at least think that there is an author speaking behind it. Now that is even unclear. But nonetheless, I think it makes it interesting, the text, the dialogue structure, because it allows Serres to do different things than a standard essay or argumentative text would do. And one is you could read it also in the long line of a Platonic dialogue or Socratic dialogue, which has several effects. Like, for instance, there is no need for a kind of fixed conclusion, an ultimate answer of what is an angel or something like that. But there can be open questions, diverging visions. They don't have to agree, and they not always agree in the book. They come to conclusions that are not necessarily compatible. That's one point. And the other one is, I think we have discussed that in past episodes as well, that as Serres would say in also some interviews, that he would use these kind of protagonists, like Deleuze and Guattari would use conceptual persona, right? And that, of course, is a whole question on itself. What do Deleuze and Guattari mean by that, for instance? But let me say this, the use of that kind of protagonist, that figures, that persona, to build a philosophical text, once again allows you to do something very interesting, and something that we have already talked about a bit, namely that instead of an author just speaking in his or her own name, one can let a certain perspective, position, character speak freely. It creates a kind of, or a set of opportunities to articulate new things that can even surprise the author himself, Serres in this case. It's a bit like in fiction, which the book looks very much like. Like a good fiction book has characters for which it is true that at a certain moment the writer has actually lost control over them. They start following their own logic. Like, even if the writer is writing or the reader is reading, it provokes things like, well, she would never say such a thing. Or if this would happen, of course, he would respond in that way. That kind of constraint that even the author has to respect, even though the author never intended them to exist. And I think something very similar happens in this book by Serres with these two figures and their discussions about angels. It probably provoked or directed him in all kinds of new ways to new debates, new questions about angels. So in that sense, it can be very reflexive about that book. And indeed, there are two angels. And here again, you get that question of distortion, of transformation through these angels. Yes, they were there to transmit a message from Serres to us, but in somewhere in between, they got a life of their own, did their own things, or at certain places, then to be redirected by Serres, perhaps in a new chapter. But I think Serres wanted to precisely create that freedom in that book, which makes it also very interesting read.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you think that's interesting because it immediately moves the idea of messages away from the human, the purely, human-centric, I am speaking to someone and communicating something, whereas Serres opening that up to the entire existence is angels in the sense of messages and messengers. And it's not always a human feat. I mean, of course, he gives the example of wind, and we would never think of wind as a message. But he understands, wind and natural forces as forms of communication. And in that way, he sort of deconstructs that purely human notion of communication.
I think indeed the book embodies that message itself in a way. That's as these conceptual persona, well, they are not humans. They are fictions created by us, etc. We can give them a human name, but that doesn't change a lot. But also content-wise, indeed, and that's not particular to this book, but to that central theme of communication, as I said, you have a kind of picture of messengers can be everything and everyone, not just humans, not just culture, but also natural phenomena. So Serres sees communication not as restricted to humans, but it can be applied to non-humans as well. And especially in that example also of the wind or climate, I think it's another example that he gives. There's a kind of, I would say, Bergsonian theme, namely the question also of memory and of inscription and all these questions. And if you take the term information, I think I made the same point in another session. If you really look at the word itself, it's putting the form into something else, right? The form is either present in something, or better, you actively put it into something. So if I perceive something, for instance, and store it in my memory, well, what we see is that the kind of structural form of the thing I saw has, through the medium or the angel of light, stored that form in another form in my eyes, which stores it in my brain, and so on. I can then translate it through the angel of language, you could say, and so on. You always have this question again of distortion. But the idea is, of course, that that pattern that is at work in my brain, etc., of information storage, of inscription of information on my brain, etc., is not particular to humans or even to biological organisms. We can find it in rocks, which are informed by the weather, or in the case of climate, which is always informed by what happens to the wind, ocean movements, and so on. So I think about indeed how archaeologists or geologists read the landscape or read these rocks, etc. They retract the kind of information that is stored in there. So in that sense, these artifacts are, again, some kind of angels transmitting an old message, which was, again, for them, perhaps noise. It was something that they threw away. It becomes extremely relevant, extremely interesting for archaeologists. They love to find trash of old people, whereas it used to be completely worthless. But so in that sense, the object itself can really be an angel, a messenger as well. And according to Serres, this is actually not remarkable. But again, if you start from the legend of angels to read the modern world, you will find it everywhere.
And in that sense, the angel, as says, the reason why angels are invisible is because they are disappearing to let the message go through them, which was in an interview. So the as we were speaking about earlier, you know, that distinction, which is quite famous in communication, of the medium and the message, for Serres, then that they would never be clear cut. They had sort of, I guess, constantly shape shifting into one another, and you can never really discern which is which. And in that, some thing we might consider as the messenger disappears. You can never truly get a hold of it.
Yes, there are a lot of paradoxes linked to that medium that Serres finds very fascinating. And indeed, in one of his repeated claims is that a good angel is one that disappears, so it's not visible. And a bad angel becomes the center and becomes our new god. That's as he puts it somewhere. And so two things. One is the invisibility. I think an example that he gives, I think in an interview, was the interpreter. So Serres, obviously, as most French people, his English was not that good, but of course, in some cases, you can have an interpreter, someone translating it. And then he says, well, a good interpreter becomes invisible. You do not notice the person anymore. It is as if you're directly speaking to the other person. Nowadays, we'll probably think about that in terms of Google Translate or something like, or these new, not persons anymore, but software. Again, good software doing the translation, a good dubbing of a movie even. If it's good, it becomes invisible. If it's bad, you will focus on the medium, not the message. You will focus on the parasite that is between there. And in that sense also, that other element, bad angels, they become not only visible, but even they can become a kind of focus point for our attention. I think again of all these questions about commercials and when the focus is not so much on the knowledge anymore, but on the format, and then we started to focus on how those formats want to reshape society in certain forms, wants us to be good consumers, etc. And in that sense, you have that tendency also of bad angels who are just big parasites. They tend to eat all and give nothing in return.
So a bad angel seems to be an angel which is identified with its ability to be the messenger, as opposed to just relaying the message. You know, they're sort of quite arrogant in their ability to. They've got control of the message in some sense. Then they know it.
Yeah, that in the cases where indeed the distortion is extremely visible and perhaps intentional by that angel, that they want to transform the message into something else. Again, you will find that in news articles as well. If the interviewer or the article is bending the truth in a form, in a different format, or that it's clear that that the interview was very selective in the quote that it highlighted or the title that it picked, then you see the journalist doing the interview. Again, a good interview, the journalist is almost invisible, and it's the person itself speaking or something like that. But again, I would say that's also relative of the objective. So whether the angel is bad or good depends also on what you want from it. Again.
Okay. Is there anything you'd like to add about the angel's text that we haven't covered so far?
Well, just the point that we have not discussed that much, but it's also more tricky, is indeed, as we said before, that it's not just about the question of communication, but that there is also an ethical dimension, not just in what kind of communication do we want, but even themes about poverty and redistribution. I think Serres somewhere, when he indeed uses even the metaphors of heaven and hell, he has also this image of, or there are two elements there. One is who is flying the planes? Well, typically it's not the poor people, it's rich people, especially in his time in the 90s. And nowadays it's a bit more expanded, you could say anyway, but it has new problems. So you also have questions about distribution of wealth and of happiness and something like that, linked to this question of angels in that sense. Precisely those capable to also completely leave the material world behind are typically those who are already materially well off, whereas those in poverty tend to be very linked to the embodiment of their place, society, culture, and whatnot. So that's I think one element worth stressing. And another one is in the book, I think you already find Serres, I think, pleading for a basic income and all these elements, a kind of utopic society, again linked to this question of embodiment and of angels in the form of a kind of three-step history, typical Serresian scheme, I would say, where work used to be linked with things, then it became linked to kind of processes, and now it becomes linked with information, etc. So again, disembodied away from the material world to service industry and something like that, to online forms of work and whatnot. And again, in this book, at least, Serres gives a very utopic picture of that, and it's kind of freeing ourselves from the burden of labor, kind of very religious theme, you could almost put it in that sense. It's going back to Eden in that sense, leaving all that work behind. And that's also a dimension you will find in the book. He's very positive about that evolution of information theory and the informational society. Again, something we would probably not be as unambiguously nowadays as he was in the 1990s.
And he retains that optimism all the way through to Thumbelina, which was quite a late book. So I don't think that ever dropped off for Serres.
No, it's true indeed. In Thumbelina, it's a celebration of leaving the visible angels behind, you could say, the teacher and the professor who has to direct you, or the news anchor who has to say what the news is. You can find it yourself. But perhaps the tricky thing was precisely that angels did not disappear, but they became at first sight invisible. But nowadays they become visible again, namely in the form of Facebook and whatnot, who is not just there to inform us, but also just to make us click on ads and whatnot, right? And then they become visible again. And then we see that they are bad angels for the kind of things or the goals and ambitions that we have in our society. So indeed, I tend, say, not to follow in that enthusiasm about the informational society.
Okay. There is a one sort of final question, because the Serres briefly begins, quite elusively though, I think he does actually use the term, he begins to talk about artificial intelligence at some point in the book. And what do you think Serres' understanding of artificial intelligence is, or would be? But of course this is written in the 90s, so it would be a different understanding than... Then again, I guess it wouldn't, right? It's the same concept throughout.
Yeah, so indeed, AI has a history of its own, but the first summer was already there, but I think it was in the winter that we are there, in the 1990s. And what he precisely means by that is a broad question, I would say, a hard question. On the one hand, you could say he uses it at certain places in the sense we talked about it above. Namely, information is everywhere, so there is a kind of artificial intelligence everywhere. But then I would say it's always soft AI, as they would call it, not hard AI. That is intelligence, not in the form as humans have it, but a kind of fixed local forms of intelligence. That objects can behave in very complex ways, but if you put them in another situation, then it all goes horribly wrong. The theme of AI, not at the same time, or the question, it reminds me also a bit of in a number of other books, and you will find it a bit in this book as well, I think. Serres often describes a kind of double history of mathematics, where, to put it very simply, you have a model of proof that is contrasted with a kind of algorithmic intelligence linked to AI, you could say. Either you could come to forms of knowledge through proof and argumentation or intuition or something like that, or you do it by brute force following a certain set of principles, what we would call now machine learning, for instance. And he links it somewhere to also, so it's a constant historical struggle, and where for a long time the model of proof was dominant, now more and more this algorithmic intelligence becomes dominant. And he links it also to, for instance, just to highlight his creativity once again, to Plato's dialogue of Meno. So when you have the situation there, famously when a slave boy is asked how to prove the theorem of Pythagoras, right? Mm-hmm. So the boy is asked how to double the area of a square, and then he gives all kind of confident answers. You achieve this by doubling the length of the size, and Socrates always shows that it's wrong, and the slave boy eventually gives up, and then Socrates guides the slave boy by means of a simple step-by-step questions to the correct answer. Showing famously that all people have a kind of memory of this knowledge and those kind of claims that follow from it. Now, what's interested Serres is precisely the method that Socrates follows there. A step-by-step question, it is just almost following an algorithm. So it's a kind of struggle between different forms of knowledge that Serres, again, uses to reread the whole history of mathematics and of our society. And at those moments, I think there are later books than the Angel book, he will also be a bit skeptical of precisely the dominance of this algorithmic intelligence. Is this the right way to do it? Well, for some elements, yes, but for other elements, it's not. I think there's also an optimism there that it is distributed. Everyone, like the slave boy, can have access to that knowledge. But through algorithms embodied in my computer, for instance. But again, you could say there is also things that are risked being lost in the process through that history. So in that sense, what AI means, what the position is, again, depends a bit like the figure of the angel, what one uses as the persona to read the whole history of mathematics or of our society.
Okay. Well, I think we've somehow managed to cover the book quite articulately there. Is there anything you feel we've missed? Obviously, there is a lot more going on in the text.
Yeah, there is, and as you said in the beginning, there are a lot of images also being used by medieval angels, or also planes as angels or whatnot. So yes, this is a kind of attempt. We have attempted to be angels of the book, but let us be honest enough also that it's not the same as reading the book itself. It is a far richer experience, precisely again because the message in the book is not just a set of propositions that we try to repeat here or something like that, but it is also again to on a more fundamental level to make you again rethink on what is your scheme of noise and information, to look at contemporary society on many levels, on information, but also on poverty, on ethics, on politics, etc.
Yeah, that's something I would reiterate as well. If you can get your hands on the physical edition of the book, it is it's a very large book, complete with images, as you say. But it is quite difficult to get your hands on the book now. But if you can find a copy, it is a more than simply a sort of theoretical experience in a way. But I guess we should also add that you are you allowed to talk about it? You're almost complete on your book, which I think last time you came on, you were just mentioning that you were undertaking, I think. So it's in the proof stages.
Yes. I think indeed last time I mentioned I was writing, still in the final stages of writing a book on, it's called also Michel Serres, French Philosophy of Science. And now it's in the final stages, the proof stages. So it will be there. So the deadline is still, or the kind of ideal deadline is April 2022. It will be with Bloomsbury Press. And it will, again, as I said then, mainly focus on how Serres and many of his notions are linked to particular debates in French philosophy of science or French science also. So it's also Jacques Monod or information theory in France and these kind of elements. So it's a kind of legend, you could say, on its own to read Serres. So it's not an attempt to articulate Serres, his own statements to the fullest, but kind of set of number of aids to help the reader to read the same books by Serres that you might have already read 10 times. Well, the 11th time, looked through the lens of French philosophy of science, it can again show you a set of other different ideas about what's going on and why Serres is making these claims in these books.
Okay. Well, I look forward to reading it in April. Yeah. Massimiliano Simons, thanks very much.
Thank you for having me. It was, again, a pleasure to talk about Michel Serres.